everyone? Welcome to Let's Talk Markets with Dave Lauer. I am your co-host, Ink, and today we have a special guest, Renato Mariotti, and his list of accolades is far too long, so I'll let him present himself. How are you doing?
I'm doing well. So yeah, hi. I'm a partner at a big law firm, Brian Cave, Leighton Paisner, and a former federal prosecutor. But I also am a legal analyst, and I talk about all sorts of things legal related. Columnist for Politico, and I have my own podcast called It's Complicated. And in that podcast, we break down complex legal issues. A lot of them are right now focused on all these politicians who seem to be getting themselves in trouble. But, we've covered SBF and other issues as well.
Awesome. Love that. Maybe we can get to that later too, because SBF just can't stay out of trouble. But you're here today to provide some legal insight. Typically, we don't get into individual tickers. So if this isn't your pet ticker that we're talking about today, don't come for us, because we don't typically go into detail as a regular practice. But we did want to go into some of the recent things that were going on with AMC and APE, and we wanted to get a legal perspective. So that's why you're joining us today, and we're very glad to have you here. So thanks for joining us.
Yeah, absolutely. It's been really interesting to be thinking about this decision. I have to say, I've come into contact. I've had a lot of people try to hire me who are individual investors in AMC or AP, and so it's definitely a space where there's a lot of people interested in that ticker for good reasons and bad.
Yeah, This is definitely something we see on social media a lot, on our platform, on Irvin a lot, where there's a lot of interest in some a set of particular companies. And what we try and do, like you say with your podcast, we try and help people understand complex things in the world of finance and market structure. And a lot of people asked us a lot of questions on this AMC case and the judge rejecting this settlement. And, I can only distill so much from reading, judges' decisions. You give me an SEC filing and I'm good. That's the extent of my ability to translate legalese, unfortunately.
Yeah, it is a little complicated, even for myself in getting ready for today's episode. I was reading that decision. It is dense. There's a reason that people go to law school and spend years reading legal decisions. You get used to it after a while. But I think there's a lot of background here, right, that's unusual. AMC is not a typical company that has people investing in it. And here's what I mean. Let's just say a typical company that's listed on NYSE or NASDAQ. People are investing because ultimately they're getting essentially a tiny piece, right? A very, very tiny piece of that company. And they're thinking about all the things that company owns, maybe the assets they have or potential future. And they're like, oh, I'm really bullish on this particular segment of the economy, or I think that they're undervalued. They haven't considered all of the shopping malls that this company owns, or whatever, real estate or something else. And they think it's a good investment. Here, there's been, there's a lot of derision, I think unfairly, but derision by commentators talking about it as a meme investment. But nonetheless, I think it's fair to say, the way I would put it is, a lot of people in the investing public, this has captured their interest. AMC is it's very exciting. There's a lot of legal issues around sort of how the price has been, you could argue manipulated up or down, but the bottom line is there's a lot of investment in AMC, and it's actually had a positive impact on that company because they have not faced as dire of consequences as a lot of their competitors, because they're getting this influx of investment from people like you and me.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can easily argue individual investors saved the company in the pandemic, allowed the company to raise more capital, much as individual investors did that for other companies. GameStop, I think, being another great example of that. And, I have to say, it just on a sort of tangent, whatever people might think of this movement of individual investors, I personally have enjoyed getting to know a lot of diverse people in these communities. And when we started our company, you might not know this, but we crowdfunded our company and under Reg CF. And we did that being inspired by this movement where people, when they bought shares in these companies, they became their most passionate advocates, their best customers, and their shareholders. And, I think that's a really cool model. I really do. I think there's a lot to be said for it. I think people should be rational about how they manage their finances and responsible, of course. But, you know, I do think that there's a really nice side to this whole story when you have shareholder engagement like that and shareholder engagement with the company they invest in. I think traditionally markets have been something in which it's much more abstract, right? And you invest, and that's just you have this slate of investments, and you don't really, you know, engage directly with those companies other than maybe buying something from them from time to time. And I think we're sort of seeing a generational shift in markets from that perspective. And you know, that does bring us to like sort of the root of the issue here, which is that AMC wanted to raise more money at some point in the past, and they ran into some trouble to doing that, right? And so then they created this other class of share.
That's right. So I think that's a good way of putting it. So AMC, you know, and their CEO has publicly said they're very appreciative of the fact that they've gotten this influx of investment. Like you said, Dave, I think you know, they claim it saved the company. And so they're trying to figure out how can we keep issuing shares, because the more shares that we issue, the more investment we're getting from lots of people who I think have a personal connection to the company, by the way, in a way that you don't on most companies that are listed in the New York Stock Exchange, right? I mean, you know, most of us aren't personally connected to some steel company or something, but you know, we all go and we get our popcorn and watch movies and so on. So what happened was, of course, there's a limit on the number of common shares that can be issued by AMC. That, you know, now there was a limit that had sort of was already in place. And in order to change that, in order to get authority to issue more shares, you would actually need to have a shareholders meeting and get a vote on that. Mm-hmm. One of the consequences of having so many shares out there and so much investment by ordinary folks, as opposed to institutional investors showing up, you know, some 401k plan showing up, you know, owning 20% of the shares or 5% of the shares, you know, it's very hard to even get a quorum to do that.
Yes,
very challenging.
It's a serious issue for companies, right? In getting the individual investors, retail shareholders engaged for shareholder votes. It's a huge problem.
Absolutely. And they were trying to explore different ways they could do that. But if you get too innovative, there may be an issue. You may create a litigation. You may give somebody like me a payday in terms of you know, getting paid to file a lawsuit. You know, some investors, you know, think that that's unfair, or, you know, the procedures weren't followed and so on. And so their way of getting around that was that they already had authority to issue preferred stock, additional shares of preferred stock. And this was under the agreement that they had with their like before they were with a predecessor company that had owned them. This was a pre-existing authority that they had. So what they did, so usually just so we make clear what preferred stock is, typically, Dave, preferred stock is a different class of stock that has a priority when a company is, you know, liquidated or bankrupt or something like that. Often, if you're an early stage company and like a VC is investing, they want preferred shares so they don't get diluted. The founder can get diluted later. Or if they're concerned about it might fail, they want to at least get, you know, some of their money back. So it's usually in those sort of circumstances where you have preferred shares. But here, what they did is essentially created a different class of shares, and they actually gave, and they called it APE, which my understanding is that's a kind of a meme for AMC investors. Am I right about that?
You know, I think a lot of individual investors use that term to describe themselves outside of AMC, within AMC for sure. And you know, so you have the apes. The apes are very passionate about the companies they invest in, and this was definitely sort of in homage to them that they named the security. It was pretty funny, I thought.
Right. So I would say it was not intended to be, or they weren't marketing this as a way of sort of screwing individual investors. It was marketed as an opportunity to allow additional investment into AMC. Basically, AMC realizes this is a boon for them to get all this money from average folks. So they're trying to figure out a way to do it. And they basically were giving people who had existing shares of AMC, they were essentially splitting AMC and giving you a share of APE, right? Is I want to make sure I understand that.
Yeah. So when the distribution happened, it was 1-for-1 distribution. So if you owned a share of AMC, you got an additional share of APE. And it was interesting at the time as I watched it, because when the distribution happened, you would have thought it would have acted like, as you're describing, like a stock split in which both securities ended up at the same value. But they never did. If they did, it was just like very briefly as it was first happening. But they very quickly diverged, and APE has traded at a substantial discount to AMC ever since it was distributed.
Yeah, it's a very interesting thing, because you would think that there'd be a very high correlation between the two, like you said. And so I represent a lot of traders, and I have in the past. And, usually this is what they call an arbitrage opportunity, right?
Yep.
Where they can take advantage of that difference. And so there have been a lot of discussions online and a lot of speculation about why there's a price difference and whether or not AMC, for example, is being manipulated. One caution I'm going to give to everyone who is listening, regardless of what, particular equities you're investing in, be careful about trying to use online forums to, maybe pump up the price of a particular stock. There can be allegations that you're engaging in wrongdoing, so you really need to be careful about that sort of thing. But nonetheless, I think it's my takeaway would be, I can't understand exactly how every investor is thinking about it, Dave, but my sense of things is that people were a little cautious or a little hesitant about this new APE stock. They didn't really know what they were getting.
Yeah, I think it was confusing to a lot of people. And then I think when you looked at it, and I looked at it from a trader's perspective, that was how I first, was paying attention, and I saw the divergence. And at first I was like, wow, that's as juicy of an arb as you could possibly find. So how do you trade that? And then you start to dig into it, and you see, with AMC, it's very hard to get shares to sell short. And when you can find the shares, it's the cost to borrow is astronomical, because they're all accounted for. And part of the reason, and there are all sorts of other reasons that we don't, outside of the scope of this conversation, but part of the reason is the ARB. And so, it's easy to say, well, short AMC, buy APE, and when the conversion happens, you're gonna be golden. But that phrase, when the conversion happens, that's the tricky part, and that is what is killing the traders who put the ARB on right now. It's killing them because they're paying that cost to borrow every month, and it's not converting. And this is part of what we're here to talk about, right?
That's right. So, usually when you have a lawsuit, let's just say you have a lawsuit between, Coke and Pepsi, okay? Or pick two companies out of a hat. Well, ultimately there's a settlement when those two sides agree. It's very simple. It's very straightforward. Here, there was a lawsuit filed by someone on behalf of a class of AMC investors, not APE investors, which I think becomes important later on in the story. But essentially the bottom line was, there was a class action that was brought. So what is a class action? Just so everyone understands, it's a term that gets thrown around, but it's not completely understood. The class action is a mechanism to make sure that an entire group of people who've all been harmed basically the same way can bring a lawsuit in a way that's economical, because it's not going to surprise you to learn that lawyers are very expensive. They cost a lot of money and so on. And so let's just say you have a company that harms everyone $5. Let's say, there's a bank that, by mistake deducts $5 from everyone's bank account. Well, yes, by mistake, quote unquote, by mistake, maybe allegedly fraudulently. I don't know, right?
Allegedly opens up 10 accounts under your name that you didn't ever intend to open.
Right, but if they do that to 1 million people, you can imagine a situation where if you didn't have a class action provision, if you didn't allow for that, they could get away with it, right? Because it's going to cost you more than $5 to hire a lawyer. It's going to cost you more than $5,000 to hire a lawyer. So what happens is that somebody, And it's often, by the way, like labor union pension funds and others who end up being the plaintiffs for this because they hold a variety of stocks. They'll hold everything in the S&P 500 or everything listed in NYSE, so they can essentially be a plaintiff's lawyers, stand in as what's called a class representative. In other words, somebody who is in this group of people is more or less in the same situation as everyone else. If everyone loses $5 in my hypothetical from the bank, then everyone's essentially in the same situation. They suffered the same harm. There are a lot of problems, though, and a lot of hurdles in terms of bringing a class action. One of them is if everyone is harmed differently. If a hurricane hits Florida, having a class action of everybody in Florida or everyone in a particular county doesn't really work because everyone has different size homes and maybe the hurricane impacted their property differently and so on. And so when you have a settlement involving class action, first of all, a judge has to approve those settlements. And the reason a judge approves those settlements is to make sure that you don't have a kind of swindle where you have this supposed class representative and their attorney getting some sort of boondoggle or windfall at the expense of the million people that they're supposedly representing. And then second of all, one thing that the judge needs to make sure of is whether what the sort of settlement that they are entering into, actually they're authorized to do it because they're representing that class of people. So in other words, if, for example, in my hurricane example, if I'm like all homeowners in this particular Broward County, Florida, and it turns out that like somebody owned a condo that's not a home, then they're not part of my class.
Okay, so that makes sense. So then what precipitated this, I believe, was that AMC wanted to do a reverse split and a conversion. So they wanted to convert the apes from being an ape share to being a share of AMC, which was part of the original intention of the issuance of the apes as well. And AMC shareholders, as you're saying, brought this suit because they felt they were being harmed.
Yes.
In that one-to-one conversion. And so the settlement arrived at an answer in which it would be something like 0.88 to 1 instead of a 1-to-1 conversion. And that was deemed, at least, I guess, by the class representatives to be a sufficient, conciliation to move forward with the settlement.
That's right. And that's why I was giving these examples. I was sort of setting up the specifics that you just talked about, which is that, so ultimately class representatives, so in this case, they're representing AMC shareholders. They reach this agreement with the company. And you might think if you're just listening along while you're working out or driving, you're like, okay, problem solved. We have AMC's class representatives, who've agreed to this. The companies agreed to this. Everyone wins as we've got an agreement. The issue is, as I just mentioned a moment ago, when there's a class action, it goes to a judge. In this case, it's a judge in Delaware. If this isn't familiar to everyone in this podcast,
why Delaware? What are they doing there?
Why Delaware? So I think it's something like over 2/3 of American companies are incorporated in Delaware. And it's because it's kind of weird. It's because their state laws have been interpreted in a way that is very, I would say, amenable to businesses quickly determining and issues of corporate law quickly determining, the outcome of disputes. And they actually have a court system, and they have a chancery court that is judges, not juries, who are basically experts on Delaware corporate law, who hear primarily, because there's so many corporations that are incorporated in Delaware, hear primarily corporate issues, and essentially are, pros who have, specialized in adjudicating these issues. And so they happen very quickly because a typical lawsuit, I'm often explaining typical lawsuits, on television or the radio or something. And people are like, why is this case taking 5 years? Why was this guy And the reality is that that's how our legal system typically works. It's not like that in Delaware, which is why the settlement was reached. and we're already on within a very short period of time, there's a decision by a judge, and you and I are already on a podcast talking about it.
Right.
That's good for business to get decisions.
Right, let me just ask, and maybe this is a dumb question, I don't know, but what the heck's a chancellor? What is that? I've never even heard that before.
So there's a division in law in many states between what's called law and chancery. Okay. And law claims are claims for money. Chancery are claims about something else. And you may say, well, this is about stock, and so therefore it's about money. Right. But it's not really. It's about sort of whether or not shareholders can, how a particular stock, can be, converted into a different type of stock, right? So it's not really, you're trying to get
monetary damages here.
Yeah, you're trying to get the court to do something or to prevent something from happening. The issue is called an injunction, which is how courts force, I'll put that in air quotes, if you're listening on without a video, they force people to do things. They issue an order that basically compels them to do things. That is what was being sought in this case.
Okay, got it. So there's a settlement, and it goes to the judge, and the judge says no. Is that standard? Does this happen often, or is this really exceptional?
It is unusual, and there's a few things that happened here, and I think I want to give the judge credit for very carefully. The judge wrote a very lengthy opinion, which was, I think an interesting read. One thing that the judge, I think, first of all, just they took into account here was the views of a lot of people who are probably listening to this podcast. A lot of ordinary people like you and me, who, when she appointed someone who's in a role called a special master, people may not be familiar with what a special master is, but they're essentially somebody who has particular expertise in an area, who acts as a more or less an outside advisor to the judge on that particular area. So the special master actually assembled assembled the views of investors, reviewed them, because when there's a settlement like this, individuals can say, I want to opt out. I don't agree with this deal, or this is a bad deal, judge, don't approve it. Something, something along those lines. There are objections. So she had the special master look through all those. But one thing that was unusual that kind of happened here in the end is where the judge came out, to spoil our ending, where the judge came out was she basically said this class action of AMC stockholders cannot represent the APE folks.
Right.
And I'm sure a lot of people listening are like, well, wait, aren't they the same thing? Because the people who had AMC shares got APE. But, maybe at time one, like 1 millisecond after, that may have been true. But since that time, as we were just talking about, Dave, there's lots of people trading these, right? A lot of people trying to get arbitrage opportunities. So there's all sorts of people out there who own APE who don't own AMC shares. And so actually you have a whole class of people who are not being represented and may very well have a different view. And so the judge, and I don't think it's worth getting into all the details, but the judge walked through a bunch of ways in which hypothetically the APE folks could have a different view than the AMC folks. I say folks, I mean the shareholders, about how this should shake out and what the conversion rate should be.
Yeah, so I think that obviously that's the crux of the issue here that we've gotten to now. And okay, so what I'm really interested in is the immediate response from the AMC side was, oh, okay, we will strike this line, we will resubmit the settlement. That addresses your concerns, right, Judge? So I think I have two questions for you on that. One, does that actually address the judge's concerns? And do we know that that's the totality of the judge's concerns?
We don't. We don't know what the totality of the judge's concerns are. I think it's understandable, by the way, and I actually appreciate the approach. Having what I'll call a practical approach to solving problems is a underrated trait amongst lawyers. Lawyers often find approaches that require them to spend thousands of hours billing to come up with things. So there's nothing bad about that, especially since a lot of people's money is wrapped up in this company. But I guess what I suspect is that the judge's concerns aren't going to be fully met until someone essentially is showing up, as a representative of this class of APE shareholders, or she can be convinced, unless she can be convinced that these changes totally do away with any scenario in which the APE investors, people who own those shares, who are going to have different interests than the people who invest and only have shares in AMC. And I don't know whether that's the case or not. I think the burden is going to be ultimately on the people who are trying to, on both sides that are trying to get the settlement approved, to make that showing. But she, understandably, like most judges, wants to avoid more lawsuits in her courtroom. So she's not interested in, approving a settlement that's going to, generate a whole other lawsuits that's going to end up in her courtroom from the APE stockholders saying that they got cheated based on this.
Okay, so that's, and that leads exactly to my next question. So that's really interesting, because when I've seen some coverage of this and they've said, oh, this is actually the judge laying out a roadmap for the APE holders to now form a class and have their own lawsuit. So even if this settlement does get approved, does that actually mean this conversion will happen? Or is the next step now there's another class that's going to come together to block the settlement?
So one thing that I can't know, and I'll just flag this out. I want to be. I don't like
you
these
tell the
people.
future. Come on, Renato. What are you here for? You can't tell the future.
I can't. I hate these people who say they aren't willing to tell you what they don't know. One thing I don't know is how much money there is, how real her concerns, like how real are these concerns about the APE shareholders have. In other words, the judge may be making a mountain out of a molehill. If she is, you could imagine if it needs to get done to get the settlement through, there being some energy to create some class and have somebody appointed just so that they can sign off and rubber stamp this agreement. But if there is actual money on the table, if this actually is worth fighting about, if the juice is worth the squeeze, so to speak, then you could see, let's say, a lot of people who have a lot of interest in APE, who have a lot of those shares, coming in and saying, no, I have totally different views. Maybe eventually class is appointed. Maybe they, assert their own claims, as you suggest. To me, what that turns on is, in the real world, whether or not those claims are, like I said, the juice is worth the squeeze, whether those claims are worth hiring a lawyer and fighting it out. And that I don't know.
Okay. Yeah, fair enough. That is an interesting take. I mean, I can tell you from a trading perspective, from an arbitrage perspective, when you look at this and you're like, oh, well, Ape's trading it at $1.80 and AMC at $5. And if I can get 0.88, conversion, as an Ape holder, I think it would be hard to argue that economically that's not beneficial to you. But you might be holding Ape back when it was issued 1-to-1. And so you might actually have a concern with that. Right.
So let's say you have a large holdings in Ape. Let's say I got 1 million shares of Ape. I mean, I don't even know how many are out there, but just type a round number. I got 1 million.
Millions are out there, I think. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. So I got 1 million shares of Ape, and I bought it expecting, based on promises that were made or assurances that were made, that I was going to get a 1-to-1 conversion. Now I'm getting 88 cents. So my view is, hey, I lost $120,000, right?
Yeah.
Now, is $120,000 worth it to hire a lawyer? Probably not. But if it's 12 million,
right? Yeah.
then it is. 12 million, then it is. That's why I said it really depends, because it may be that the Ape shareholders are all diffuse. It may be that everybody owns 5 shares of it, and just no one, there's not enough there to make a difference. It may be that the assurances that were made, or the expectation regarding a dollar conversion was, wasn't it's or there were certain conditions that were not met, or whatever. So there's just too many specifics for me to give a good read on that.
Understood. All right. Well, I think we've covered this pretty well. I definitely appreciate your thoughts and insight. I think we've got maybe a couple more minutes. And so I did want to ask you something completely unrelated to this, but very apropos, very, very much in the news today, which is SBF, the very fun topic of criminality or alleged criminality. And so there was a big announcement that some of the charges against him were dropped. Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. And this was, I think, in particular, the campaign finance charges.
Yeah.
And I'll just say a couple things on that. I mean, the SBF charges were some of the most swiftly brought charges I've ever seen. I mean, I have never seen a complex. I mean, I have been in this space for a long, long time. I used to be a federal prosecutor prosecuting cases like that one. I brought some really what I thought were high profile cases, maybe not Sam Bankman-Fried, but at the time were very high profile. To prosecute a case in the matter of, what was it, weeks after the bankruptcy?
It was shocking to everyone that I talked to how fast it came out.
Absolutely shocking. Okay. And at the same day, there was an SEC and CFTC action. Yep. Very unusual to have that level of coordination. Often, they were slow. And so if I wanted to wait for them, that meant that, I was going to be sitting around on my, and I would often sit there and wait for the SEC to conduct their investigation. So it was remarkable. So one thing that they included, these campaign finance charges, I will just say, I was a little surprised at the time because they're kind of extraneous to the main meat of the case. They kind of complicate the story. Mm-hmm. We're talking about how to explain things in a complicated versus simple way to a jury. I don't know if I would have even put it in there. But one thing that is involved in this is, he was, unlike most defendants who are prosecuted by the feds, by the DOJ, is he was not in the United States. He was in the Bahamas. Mm-hmm. So there was a whole issue of extradition. Now, I've been in that situation before. It is a pain in the butt to try to get people extradited from anywhere. I've tried to get people extradited from the UK, from Israel, and so on. It's not easy. When I was a federal prosecutor. And essentially what it comes down to is whether or not, usually the way the treaty comes down is whether or not there's whatever it is was a crime in both the United States and that country. And so I think there was an issue with those particular charges as to whether or not they met the four corners of the treaty between the United States and the Bahamas. Ultimately, I don't think any of this matters, to be very blunt. It just gives the bottom line. Because he's totally screwed. He's almost certainly going to get convicted. And at sentencing, the judge can take into account everything he did, including, by the way, anything he's acquitted of, which a lot of people think is pretty unfair. Even if he's found not guilty on a count, the judge can consider that. The judge can consider things he's not charged with. So the judge can consider the fact that he engaged in campaign finance fraud. I think the thing that's going to happen, though, Dave, is because this isn't going to get litigated in court, there's going to be plenty of conspiracy theories and speculation that maybe this is all being done to hide some secret or something along those lines.
Well, and to be fair, do you think a lot of politicians are breathing a sigh of relief right now?
I do think some. I mean, one thing that is clear, right, is SBF was used, I think, as his donations were used as a political tool and a political argument. And so, I'm sure politicians are. I think frankly, I think the fact that there was a lot of donations from the crypto space, from folks associated with it into politics, has actually now complicated, ironically, the road for crypto regulation. Because I think that now it's a political issue, and so everyone in politics in Washington wants to seem like they're, quote, tough on crypto. And so realistically, it's actually a roadblock, and it's going to take some time for that to change.
Yeah, and that's we talked about that. In fact, the legislative efforts around crypto last week. I think we're going to be talking about them next week. Maybe we're talking about them a little too much, but they are fascinating, and they're sort of unfolding in front of us right now. And very relevant, of course, to enforcement actions the SEC is taking, and global efforts, as you were talking about before this in your webinar. So, a topic that I don't think is going away anytime soon. But definitely, Renato, really appreciate you taking the time to come on and help to answer these questions for our audience, and to do what you do on your podcast so well, which is to try to distill complicated things and make it more understandable, especially legally complicated things, which I can struggle with. And so I appreciate that.
Well, thanks. Real pleasure being here. And you're doing a great service for a lot of people who are trying to understand very complicated things. I on my podcast, it's all law, but here, this stuff can be even more complicated.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And so thank you, everyone, for joining us again. This is the first of 2 podcast episodes that we're going to come out with this week. There's a lot to talk about this week, but we really wanted to get to this because it's very timely. And so, just I think you'll have another one queued up ready to go after this. And if you haven't already done that, please, subscribe, hit that subscribe button, hit the like button. And like I've been saying lately, as the late great Bob Barker liked to say, have your pets spayed or neutered, help control the pet population, and please adopt, don't shop. And we'll be back soon, and looking forward to covering our next topic, which is back to market structure and talking about exchange rebates and payment for order flow, which is one of our favorite topics. So thanks again, Renato, and thanks everyone for listening.